Hello, welcome to this video, and on this video I am going to be I just thought, how am I going to start this one? This one's going to be a big one, alright? And I knew I wouldn't know what to call this video, how to start, because Jeff Beck has been such an important musician in my life. Really important. A cornerstone musician. I suppose this is my tribute to Jeff Beck, and I think that's what I'm going to call the video, is my tribute to Jeff Beck. So I will start again. Hello and welcome to this video, which is my tribute to Jeff Beck. Those of you who know my channel will know that what you get here is me basically off the top of my head, free associating, exploring ideas on the spot, talking to you in real time, making mistakes, going down avenues I don't want to go down, getting confused, right? And that's what I'm about to do, but I'm going to do it on an epic level. This is going to be a big one because Jeff Beck deserves it. A few days ago, I'd gone to bed. I was lying in bed, going off to sleep, and my wife calls me. Right, she's still downstairs watching TV, and she calls me, and I think, oh my God, there's an emergency. Something's happened. She wouldn't call me at this time and wake me up unless something happened. And she was right, something had happened. And she said, Andy, I've just heard on the news that Jeff Beck's died. Oh my God, I cannot believe it. Jeff Beck, how could he have died? He was just out on tour with Johnny Depp. How could he have died? What's going on? I mean, I know he's 78 years old, but he seemed healthy. And I mean, Jeff Beck always looked like Jeff Beck. He never changed. He's Jeff Beck. It's like Keith Richards. Jeff Beck, these guys don't die. I was shocked and I put my head down on the pillow. Couldn't then go off to sleep. So I thought, I've got to do something about this. Now, of course, there is a thing that happens on YouTube with all us YouTubers, and I don't think you know about this, but it's definitely the case, is that when a big musician dies, as soon as everyone here, it's us YouTubers, we're rushing to do a video on it. Everyone wants to get their videos up first. It's quite disturbing, really, but there I am. Can I beat Rick Beato? Can I get there before him? And so I get up and I get dressed. I put my clothes on over my pyjamas and I come down into this studio in the middle of the night. I put my little light. I haven't got any proper lights, and I filmed an off-the-cuff tribute to Jeff Beck. I then got upstairs and I started to upload it, and as I was uploading, I could see that Rick Beato was live streaming his tribute, because of course he's Rick Beato, so he's in the know, and somebody had let him know about Jeff's passing the day before, so they got it all ready, and there's me, lowly me, trying to get my tribute out, and I'd stumbled my way through it, but I felt that it was heartfelt, and I felt I'd got to somewhere at the end of that video. I was able to express how I felt about it. But over the last few days, I've been thinking, oh, I should have said that, and I should have said this, and I didn't explain that, and I didn't explain this about Jeff Beck, and Jeff Beck deserves this. Jeff Beck's so important. He's been there from the beginning for me, and so I've decided to really come on here and do a big detailed video about Jeff Beck, and I'm really going to go as deep as I can. I've never really done this with an artist like this before, except perhaps my video on Frank Zappa, but then I had the albums in front of me, and I was just talking about here. I will go through his albums. I'm going to go through everything I possibly can. This is my tribute to Jeff Beck. So if you're a Jeff Beck fan, I hope you enjoy this. If you're not and you just want to know more about Jeff Beck, because everyone's talking about him, you will get that from this video. So get yourself a nice cup of tea, get yourself some biscuits. If you're not sure what biscuits to get, then go and check out my video on biscuits. That will help you. Or some cakes if you don't know what a biscuit is. Right. So, where do we start with Jeff Beck? Well, I think the best place to start with Jeff Beck, right, is with the track Shape of Things, which was released in February 1966 by the Yardbirds. Right, Jeff Beck, He's this new young guitarist on the scene. He's 22 years old. He's been on the scene in London for a while. You know, he's played with a whole host of people. He's had a band called The Night Shift and he's done stuff with them. You know, he's played on sessions, okay? How has he got onto this sort of London session scene at that time, at that age? Well, he's got on it because he's friends with Jimmy Page, right? Jimmy Page is also a very young guitarist, exactly the same age as Jeff Beck, born in 1944, and they're both in London on the scene. Jimmy's actually got there earlier. Jimmy's been pulled in because he lives in London and he knew a few people and he could play Chuck Berry solos, right? And the snotty session guitarists that are on the sessions at the time, people like, you know, Big Jim Sullivan and John McLaughlin, right, that could sight read anything and play anything. They could play anything, but they weren't up to doing Chuck Berry solos. So who should we get to, you know, do these Chuck Berry solos on these sessions? So they bring in a very young Jimmy Page. And Jimmy Page gets trained up. He has lessons off John McLaughlin on how to get through sessions, get his reading up, all right? And he's on the scene, very, very young, at a very, very young age. Now, Jimmy Page had been introduced to Jeff Beck by Jeff's sister when they were 13 years old. And they bonded over their love of Les Paul, you know, of guitars like Lonnie Mack, Cliff Gallup, you know. This is the first generation to be not only influenced by rock and roll guitar, but also electric guitar. Jeff Beck at a young age falls in love with electric guitar after hearing Les Paul, and he bonds with very young Jimmy Page. Jimmy Page gets in there, and then Jimmy is now passing session work on to Jeff. He goes to art college, Wimbledon Art College. I'm just looking this up so I'll make sure I get this right. And in 1962, when he's only 18 years old, he gets the gig with Screaming Lord Sutch. Okay, so he's on the session scene, but he's not breaking ground. So this is where I think Jeff Beck, in terms of being Jeff Beck's born when he joins the Yardbirds. Now the Yardbirds are one of these English groups that have come in after the Rolling Stones and the Beatles. They're influenced by you know, American blues, and they've sort of American blues and skiffle and rock and roll, and you put all that together and you get these groups, and these groups are taking over the world. You know, the Beatles and the Rolling Stones are taking over the world. The Yardbirds are in there, and the Yardbirds are cutting edge. They've had Eric Clapton on guitar, and Eric Clapton's come in and he's the great guitar god of that period, channeling the blues into sort of popular music through the Yardbirds. He's gone off to do Cream or whatever it is he's going to do. And they look around, they want Jimmy Page because he's the big session guy. Jimmy can't do it, so they bring in Jeff Beck. And Jeff Beck joins the Yardbirds. Now, Jeff Beck's in the Yardbirds for a very short amount of time, about 10 months. And in that time, he records basically 1.5 albums. The track Shape of Things is not on any of those albums, it's a single. But on Shape of Things, what I feel on that is we get the birth of modern rock guitaring. You know, before, I mean, we got to give credit to Clapton for bringing in that sort of Marshall distorted tone in the Blues Breakers, but that's basically blues guitar. You know, we can hear what Clapton's doing in Freddie King and Buddy Guy and all those guitarists. We can hear that there. What Jeff Beck does on the guitar solo of Shape of Things is unlike anybody who's ever done anything before. All right, he's using feedback, but he's using the feedback to sound like a sitar. This is back in 1966, and of course it doesn't sound like a sitar. To paraphrase Brian May, it sounds like some bizarre electric wind instrument. He's taken the electric guitar, and rather than looking back for inspiration, which guitarists like Clapton are doing, and then later Peter Green and all those guys, Jeff Beck is looking forward. For me, all rock guitaring before Shape of Things sounds a little bit twee. It's all in the shadow of people like Scotty Moore and James Burton and Cliff Gallup. It's all sort of country guitaring passed through a little bit of the blues and a little bit of jazz. The idea of rock guitar, which of course Hendrix is going to come in, you know, and show everyone how to do it. Well, Jeff Beck's there a little bit before, at 22 years old, using feedback, creating sustain, and creating sounds that are otherworldly. This is the big difference between, for me, Hendrix and Clapton. Is Hendrix is also forward-looking. He's taking the blues and going forward with it. But Jeff Beck doesn't seem to be as enamoured by the blues. He's got a much wider range of listening from where he's pulling from, and that's what I find really interesting. So that's where we start. Now, Jeff Beck at this time seems to have been quite a cantankerous, ill-tempered young man, and his time in the Yardbirds is cut short because he got the sack. He got the sack for losing his temper and not showing up to gigs. They'd gone on an American tour and he just didn't want to go to a gig, so he wouldn't go to a gig. And after he did that a few times, they sacked him. I think they pulled in Jimmy Page by that point on electric guitar as well. But he's in the Yardbirds long enough to contribute to the film Blow Up, which was made in 1966. And there's a scene in that film where the protagonist, who's a photographer, goes to a nightclub and the Yardbirds are playing, strangely, to an audience that just stood there like sort of shop dummies. And they play Stroll On, and Jeff Beck does a guitar solo and smashes up his guitar. And he smashes up what looks like a Gibson L5 or 335. It's obviously something that'd be worth about 10 grand now. But anyway, he smashed, and that's another iconic moment. And this is the other thing about Jeff Beck. Jeff Beck is a rock guitarist. He's, I think, the first rock guitarist. He plays the guitar in the same way Hendrix did, and he did it a little bit before Hendrix. He's a future-looking guitarist that is using the instrument as a synthesizer to synthesize new sounds, futuristic sounds. That is the great innovation of 60s rock guitar. And that's the difference between rock guitar and rock and roll guitar. You know, a few years later, when we see Jimmy Page on stage with Led Zeppelin, and he's got the bow and he's doing all that, and he's doing that. That's him taking the electric guitar and creating these new sounds, right? But also, when you watch him in Stroll On, and these are the two moments when he sort of emerges in 1966, 57 years ago, when he emerges in 1966 with that Shape of Things guitar solo and that appearance in that film, we also see how iconic Jeff Beck was. A cool, sexy musician that would cut shapes on stage. He's as iconic as a Robert Plant. He's as iconic as a Jimi Hendrix. He is the archetypal guitar hero. You know, when they did Spinal Tap, they used Jeff Beck as the basis for the guitarist character, Nigel Tufnell. You know, that's how iconic Beck is. Those are the two things. He is not a jazz guitarist. He is not a virtuoso classical musician that's come into rock music. He is an out-and-out rock musician, and he's a virtuoso rock musician. I believe he's the most virtuoso rock musician, and we're going to get to why that is as we carry on. Okay? So anyway, 67, he's out of the Yardbirds. In 1966, in March, a month after he cut Shape of Things, he goes into the studio with Keith Moon, John Paul Jones, Jimmy Page, and I think Nicky Hopkins, and he cuts a tune called Beck's Bolero, which is a sort of pastiche of Ravel's Bolero. Right, this is an instrumental rock tune informed by classical music. Now, I've done my great big history of progressive rock, and everybody said, oh, you didn't include Procol Harum, you didn't include this band in terms of how progressive rock started. There's a strong argument that the biggest inclusion that I didn't have was Beck's Bolero. In that little track, we almost have the beginnings of progressive rock in 1966. And I think the reason why it didn't have the same effective shape of things is it didn't come out for 2 years. It doesn't come out to 1968. And even in 1968, it has the power to sound innovatory 2 years later. God knows what that track would have sounded like if they brought it out in 1966. Think what the Beatles were doing at that point. Think of what anybody was doing at that time. This is future looking, innovative rock music, right? We're seeing the beginnings of the supergroup. 1966, Cream are just about to form. They haven't quite formed yet. You know, we have the beginnings of the supergroup. We have the beginnings of the blueprint for Led Zeppelin on that track, and we have the beginnings of the blueprint for progressive rock. So at 22 years old, Jeff Beck is emerging on the scene, massively innovative. This is the future of rock music, and he's playing a huge part in that, right? He signs with Rack and he puts together the Jeff Beck group with Rod Stewart on vocals, and they record 2 albums, Truth and Beckola. These 2 albums should be, right, mentioned in the same breath as the stuff by the Jimi Hendrix Experience, the stuff by Cream, and those albums by Led Zeppelin, and then Black Sabbath and Deep Purple. And I think if we take classic rock, and by that I mean Led Zeppelin, Deep Purple, Black Sabbath, Free, you know, those types of bands, the blueprint of that is forged far more successfully on those 2 Jeff Beck albums than it is with Jimi Hendrix or Cream. This is the blueprint, you know. He goes into the studio with Rod Stewart and he records You Shook Me, the blues standard. You know, a few months later, Zeppelin go in and they record You Shook Me. Go and compare it and remember that Jimmy Page and Jeff Beck are friends, right? I believe that Jeff Beck group, the first group, is so innovative, and this is really where we see the next stage of what rock music's going to be. He's an innovator of rock music in the same era as Hendrix and Cream, but what he does is really set up what we're going to hear in the 70s. He's in other words, he's even more further out and future looking. The second album, Beckola, I think is an absolute masterpiece. Never gets mentioned. Tracks like Rice Pudding, Spanish Boots and Plinth have a heaviness in the riffing that you can hear. That's what Black Sabbath's going to do. That's what Deep Purple's going to do. There's a soulfulness as well, which is we're going to see cropping up in groups like Deep Purple. And there's an approach to the blues. There's a use of the sort of very soulful high vocal of Rod Stewart that we're going to see in Led Zeppelin. These 2 albums are really important. So why is he not getting mentioned in the same breath as a Zeppelin or a Hendrix or a Cream? Now, I think there's a number of reasons for this. Partly is Jeff Beck's all over the place. He's temperamental and he's difficult. He seems to be a difficult character at this point to pin down. Whether he was up for doing the promotional stuff that he could have done. He didn't. So, for example, the Jeff Beck group with Rod Stewart was offered the gig at Woodstock in 1969, and Jeff Beck didn't do it, and he seems to have not done it just to get on Ron Wood, who was a bass player in that band, and Rod Stewart's nerves, just to be cantankerous. He seems to be a cantankerous character. Genius, right? Look, doing the opposite, cantankerousness, difficultness, they all go together. We're dealing with a real genius here. His deal with Rack, he was signed to the Rack label at this point, which was, I think, Mickey Mouse label. Whether they could support what he was doing in the same way as Atlantic could support Led Zeppelin, I just don't think they could. And then in '69, he has a car crash and he fractures his skull, and this puts a stop to his career at that point. He's out of action, for about 2 years, right? He disappears from view. He's gone, right? And I think the momentum that he had in the late 60s is curtailed at that point. This is a really important point that people don't make about his career, perhaps. The genius he's brought down. He's convalescing. What's he going to do next? Right? At that point in time, right, he'd hooked up with the guys from Vanilla Fudge, Tim Bogart and not Vinny Appice, Carmine Appice. And they were going to form a supergroup. Now, Vanilla Fudge were also a prime leader in terms of the development of classic rock, a big influence on many bands. For example, bands like Led Zeppelin. We have to be careful what we say. But Led Zeppelin had toured with Vanilla Fudge. Jeff Beck had toured with Vanilla Fudge. Like the musicians, they were about to form a supergroup. Now, every supergroup needs its genius. You know, Zeppelin's got Jimmy Page. The fact that Jeff Beck wasn't there, the band that then formed, which was Cactus, never quite had the same effect as Led Zeppelin. Who knows? Jeff Beck, in that creative furrow that he was in at that point, maybe if he'd have formed that band with Tim Bogart and Carmine Appice, maybe we would mention them in the same breath as Deep Purple, Black Sabbath and Led Zeppelin. But he's out of action. He's out of action. Eventually, after he's got better, he puts back the second Jeff Beck group together. This is the one that's got Cozy Powell on drums, and they make 2 albums. They make an album called Rough and Ready, and they make an album which is called the Jeff Beck Group, which is often called the Orange Album. It's the one with the orange album on the top. Right. These albums for me are not as strong as what has gone before. They're interesting. The playing is fantastic. The playing on the first Jeff Beck album, in terms of classic rock that period, it's as great, if not greater, than anything that Deep Purple and Led Zeppelin done. The group he's put together is absolutely virtuoso. They got criticised. The vocals got criticised at the time for just being too over the top. The vocals are absolutely incredible. Is it Phil Tench, the singer that's in that band? Cozy Powell's drumming is great. We've got Max Middleton on keyboards, very important, collaborator with Jeff Beck. Putting those albums on again, which I did a few days ago, and I listened to them. It's an interesting mix between sort of rock music, the form of music that he has formed, and soul. That's his innovation at that time, and for me, it doesn't quite work. You know, it's going to be influential. We're going to see bands like Deep Purple move from a sort of real heavy metal, heavy rock, you know, approach to later on. They're going to be, you know, exploring that, you know, area between heavy rock and soul. You know, really pulling their influences from Stevie Wonder, but at this time, you know. Jeff Beck's actually hooked up with Stevie Wonder. He actually appears on Talking Book and they collaborate. You know, the song Superstition comes out of a jam session with Jeff Beck and Stevie Wonder. There's a strong argument, this is a contentious one, that Stevie Wonder goes from Motown stock artist to superstar when he hooks up with Jeff Beck, but that would be a hard one to argue, but it's interesting. But for me, this period, the second Jeff Beck group period, is weaker. And I think he's still struggling. He lost something after that crash. He's trying to find... He hasn't found his mojo. What is he doing next? What is he doing next? Maybe he should do this supergroup with Tim Bogart and Carmine Appice. And they do another album, which is called Beck Bogart. As I say, Bogart, Appice. They make that album. That for me is weaker than the Jeff Beck group albums. I really like the Rough and Ready album. I think that's a good album. It's not in the same league as Jeff's classic albums like Truth Be Cola or the ones we're going to be talking about in a minute. But it's a good album. The second album, which is simply called Jeff Beck Group, and I think it's called Jeff Beck Group because they're sort of out of inspiration. The cover's pretty awful as well. With that orange stuck on the little boxes with the weird photos in. The production's not as great. And the trouble with these bands is they just lack the material. It's a virtuoso rock band without material. And the Beck Bogart Appice album, that's the case. The only decent song on there is Superstition, which Beck's written by Stevie Wonder. And of course, Stevie Wonder's version is way better than the version on that album. So these albums, I think... Beck's guitar playing is incredible. He's pushing the envelope. The instrumental virtuosity is interesting, is good. Sorry, and the fusing of rock with soul is interesting, but they just don't quite work. And I think they don't quite work because the material's not there. But also, I think it's that Beck is looking for the next. He hasn't found the next route forward. Right? He hasn't found that. Around about 72, 73, he hears My Goals Beyond by John McLaughlin. He hears the track Goodbye Pork Pie Hat. He's astonished at what's going on. Now, of course, Jeff Beck in the 60s was on the session scene in London with John McLaughlin. I'm not too sure how much they knew each other from that period. McLaughlin is on sessions all the time with Jimmy Page and John Paul Jones and all those guys. So it could well be the case that he's aware of what McLaughlin's doing before then. But when you read up on it, it seems that he hears My Goals Beyond. He hears that acoustic version of Goodbye Pork Pie Hat, and his ears are pricked. Right, what's this about? And he checks it out. At that time, the Mahavishnu Orchestra is coming out. When you look at interviews with Carmine Appice, who was playing with Jeff Beck at that time, he said they're basically, they're on tour and they're just continually listening to Billy Cobham and the Mahavishnu Orchestra and John McLaughlin. That is the new thing. Jazz fusion has come out. It's the new thing. And I think Jeff Beck sees a way of him now working in instrumental music. Now, for a rock icon to make that decision is interesting. When you look at the interviews with Carmine Appice, he said once that decision was made, he then went into the studio and started to work with Jeff on the sessions that were going to become Blow by Blow, but they couldn't quite work it out. So then Carmine jumped ship, took Max Middleton with him, and he made instrumental jazz fusion, and his label would not put it out because they didn't think it's commercial. What happens with Jeff Beck seems to be the opposite. At this point, he's moved to CBS. Now, CBS, Clive Davis, is championing all these great fusion, right? So I think they had a vision for this, and they backed Jeff Beck up. And we can see this because on the album Blow by Blow, he gets George Martin as a producer, right? He once Carmine's he's got Richard Bailey on drums, who I think is a very young drummer, but he's got Max Middleton from the Jeff Beck group coming in, who I think at this point is a very important collaborator, and he's got Phil Chen on bass. George Martin's at the helm, and they bring in an orchestra and they augment some of the tracks with an orchestra. Again, this is a straight inspiration from the Apocalypse album that John McLaughlin had done with the Mahavishnu Orchestra, which has obviously the London Symphony Orchestra, and it has George Martin at the helm. So he's really taking his inspiration from John McLaughlin at this point, to put it bluntly. He's walking around saying John McLaughlin's the greatest guitarist in the world. And to be fair, John McLaughlin's turned around and said Jeff Beck's the greatest rock guitarist of all time. And Jeff Beck is the greatest rock guitarist of all time, so it's only a statement of truth. But anyway, let's get back into this. Blow by Blow has a load of money put behind it by CBS. It's a big investment in an instrumental jazz fusion album. Why aren't I saying then that Jeff Beck, this rock guitarist, came in and made a derivative fusion album at a time in 1975 when jazz fusion has had its peak with the Mahavishnu Orchestra Returns Forever, and by 75, 76 it's on a little bit of a downward spiral towards what's going to become Fusac, right? I think that Beck's input into jazz fusion and jazz and instrumental music, instrumental rock and rock guitar, all those things mixed together, has been underestimated. Of course, when somebody dies, we all look at this. I think what Beck does on Blow by Blow is he does fusion from the rock perspective rather than what we normally hear, which is jazz rock fusion from the jazz musician perspective. And I'm really going to talk about this now because I think this is an important point to make. In 1973, Billy Cobham left the Mahavishnu Orchestra and he made an album called Spectrum. And rather than pull in a jazz guitarist that's playing fusion, rather than pull in a Larry Coryell or a John McLaughlin or a John Abercrombie, you know, someone who grew up in the 1960s studying jazz but has an interest in rock and he's going from jazz over to rock, he pulled in an out-and-out rock guitarist, Tommy Bolin, who was currently playing with, I think, the James Gang. Tommy Bolin comes in, and Tommy Bolin doesn't know all those bebop lines. He's not a schooled musician. He's not a reading guitarist that will look at chord changes and be able to outline them and do the upper, you know, colour tones and neighbour tones. And he hasn't come from that vocabulary. He's a rock guitarist, right? The guys that have done this are people like Jeff Beck and Jimi Hendrix. They've had a huge influence on the development of fusion because the fusion's important, because rather than having the saxophone as the main melody instrument, as the central instrument in fusion, it moves to guitar. And it's the innovations of these rock guitarists in the 60s, and that is Hendrix and Beck, right, that then go in to fusion. So when Jeff Beck decides to do fusion, he's actually returning to the children of what he's born. Does that make sense? You know, this is a style of music which he has been involved in the creation of, and him then putting his guitar playing that acts differently to, say, John McLaughlin's guitar. John McLaughlin, if you study his career, it starts off as a proper jazz guitarist, schooled, you know, Tal Farlow, you know, schooled Charlie Christian style guitarist, who is listening to people like Hendrix, and he's having to try and find his way of how to play jazz guitar with a Hendrix tone. You can hear the development of that. Jeff Beck hasn't got that. He's just straight in there. And I think it's partially because he's not channeling the blues. He's channeling a sort of modal improvisational style, which just naturally drops into fusion. In other words, he's the guy you want. He's there. He's ready to go. I'm ready to go. You know, and on Blow by Blow, what we have is Jeff Beck's second great innovation to rock music, to music. He's moved to jazz fusion. What it does is this album becomes his biggest selling album ever. So this guy we're all talking about, his biggest selling album, his commercial peak is Blow by Blow, which is an instrumental guitar fusion album. So here we have really the basis of every guitar instrumental album that's going to exist from that day on, right? This is, you know, laying the groundwork to what Satriani's going to do or Steve Vai's going to do in the 1980s. That whole guitar explosion that happens in the 1980s, we can see how it will have its roots in what Jeff Beck has done, and especially what he does on Blow by Blow, which commercially opens up the possibility for a rock guitar player to make an instrumental album and sell a ton of records. Steve Vai did this, you know, 10, 15 years later when he released Passion and Warfare, for example. I also think he's on these albums pushing the guitar to the front, and guitarists just devouring what he's doing. He's opening up the area for people like Eddie Van Halen to come through as well. So this album is very, very important. And I would class this as his second great innovatory period. I think in terms of Jeff Beck, we've got three great innovatory periods. And this is the second one. The first one is his Yardbirds, Truth, Beckola period, where he's basically laying the groundwork of rock music. Progressive rock music, classic rock music, funk rock music, whatever you want to call it. Right, his second great phase is his fusion period in the 70s, and it starts with Blow by Blow and the follow-up album Wired, and we're going to talk about those in a minute. And this is where he really becomes the great instrumental rock performer. There is no other as great as Jeff Beck. You know, someone who's capable of selling 1 million albums with a record that's got no vocals on. I do want to talk a little bit about Jeff Beck's Blow by Blow album. Get into the details. I'm just pulling up the credits just so I get my facts right. Most of you know I do these videos off the top of my head, but with this one I am supporting myself here. So I have got the notes of Blow by Blow in front of me here, just so I got to get the track listing right and stuff like that. It opens up with You Know What I Mean, and what we've got here is a sort of Stevie Wonder, James Brown funk. So the soulful funk elements we've heard in the Jeff Beck group have amped up. This isn't the Mavish Nuptial, it's not To Return to Forever. This is heavy funk, right? Bands like Headhunters have come out at this point and they're very funk. This is written by Max Middleton and Jeff Beck. Then we get a version of She's a Woman, which is a Beatles tune. This is where we start to hear Jeff Beck as the great singer of songs. This is what makes him different to guitarists like, you know, Al Di Meola and John McLaughlin. Jeff Beck has such a signature sound on guitar that he's able to sing a song. He can play a tune, Danny Boy, and he will have you in tears because of the way he plays. He's not necessarily going to improvise, he's just going to play the tune. And that's what we have here for the first time. She's a Woman. Then we have Constipated Duck, Air Blower. Again, this funky James Brown inspired jazz fusion, right? This is going to be all the rage. You know, this is the beginnings of Fusac, but this isn't Fuseback. This is burning. This is heavy. And then right at the end we have Scatterbrain, and Scatterbrain to me is the closest he ever got to the Mavish Nuptial. Not just Mavish Nuptial Mark 1, but Mavish Nuptial Mark 2. On this we've got the drive of the original Mavish Nuptial, but we also have the orchestra in there backing it up, and it sounds very much like stuff on Apocalypse. Turn over to side 2 and we have 'Cause We Ended as Lovers, which is dedicated to Roy Buchanan. Roy Buchanan, I should do a video at some point, one of the great innovative blues guitarists, a forward-looking blues guitarist, one of the great blues guitarists that doesn't get enough credit and influence on Jeff Beck. This is written by Stevie Wonder. It's a beautiful tune, and again we then hear that again of Jeff Beck just playing a beautiful tune. And this album, it is all the better for the compositions being so strong. We've got a Beatles tune and 2 Stevie Wonder's tunes here, because the next tune, which is called Thelonious, was a tune given to Jeff by Stevie Wonder, you know, almost in gratitude for his work on Talking Book and, you know, his help in writing Superstition. And Stevie Wonder actually appears on that track. They didn't credit him at the time, but he's actually playing the clavinet on that track. So what we've got here is the compositions are really strong. We then get Freeway Jam, and that's what it is. Freeway Jam is just a jam. It's a shuffle, you know, and instrumental music often works well when it's about something. And when you listen to that track, you can hear the traffic jam. You're in a traffic jam and Jeff Beck sounds like cars. They're hooting their horn, they're edging forward. That's what we get. The album closes with one of Jeff Beck's finest moments, the tune Diamond Dust, which is here with an orchestra. It's written by Brian Holland. It's one of the most beautiful melodies to appear in the whole jazz fusion canon. So there we have it, Blow by Blow. A heavy album. The difference between what he's done with the Jeff Beck group and Beck Bogart and a piece is the quality of the compositions. You know, the tunes are so strong. Right. He follows that up with Wired. Now I get annoyed because everybody mentions Blow by Blow. Everybody goes on, and it is truly one of the great albums. I think Wired is as great as Blow by Blow, and secretly I think it's even greater. I really do. I think it's an absolute masterpiece. Again, produced by George Martin and Jan Hammer. On this album, he teams up with 2 jazz fusion greats. So two of the greatest musicians to be involved in jazz fusion. That's Narada Michael Walden, the great Narada Michael Walden. You know, I was hoping to pull out. Oh, it's over here, look. It's never far from me. This man, this guy, one of the greatest fusion drummers in history, one of the greatest fusion composers in history, one of the greatest producers in history, and one of the great artists in music history. This is a multi-talented musician that brings more to the table than just his incredible drumming. But my God, is his drumming incredible on here. As I've said over and over again, my favourite drumming is on this album. My favourite drumming of all time is Lead Boots, which is the opener on this album. I've interviewed Narada on this channel, and I asked him about Lead Boots, and astonishingly, when he went and cut that in the studio, they weren't all playing at the same time, and Jan Hammer wasn't there, because the way this album actually was made is he started on this album and then Jan Hammer was brought in. Jan Hammer also occupies a special place in jazz fusion, because he's not just an incredible jazz fusion keyboard player, he's not just an incredible composer, but this guy is going to go on to really create the sound of the 1980s with his incredible soundtrack work on the Miami Vice. He's going to have hit records. Narada and Jan Hammer in the 1980s are going to have pop hit records. They're going to sell in the millions and millions, you know. Narada's involvement on the Whitney Houston tune, you know, which he's a producer and a writer on. These are the biggest commercial tracks in history. Jan Hammer's involvement in the Miami Vice soundtrack, but also other film tracks and other pop productions, right? These aren't just two fusion superstars they're bringing in. They bring in something really special. And for me, the compositions are even stronger than Blow by Blow, and the playing is even stronger. This is a stronger album for me. Let's just go through this one track by track. I'm not going to do this for every Jeff Beck album, but I'm going to do it here. Lead Boots, it's just mind-blowing. It's perhaps my favourite jazz fusion tune. When I was a kid, I was looking for something, right? I was looking for something. I got into heavy metal, classic rock. I was listening to prog, Led Zeppelin, ELP, Genesis. I was searching for something to blow me away, and I couldn't find it, right? I got, when I was a kid, it was called The Best of Jeff Beck Volume 1, and it was basically Truth and Beckola. It was those two albums all mixed together, and that was mind-blowing. And that for me was as strong as Cream. I preferred it to Cream. It was as strong as Zeppelin or Deep Purple. That was the other great classic rock band that no one else seemed to go on about. So I love Jeff Beck. I was a big fan of Cozy Powell from when I first started listening to music. I got Tilt by Cozy Powell for Christmas when it came out, when I just started listening to music. And on that album was Jeff Beck. So Jeff Beck I knew of as being one of the great classic rock guitarists. I go and then pick up Wired. And as soon as I heard Lead Boots, as soon as I heard Narada's drumming, as soon as I heard Jeff Beck's guitar solo, as soon as I heard Jan Hammer's incredible keyboard solo that Narada told me is overdubbed. He overdubs that over the top, and it sounds like they're listening and playing to each other. It's astonishing. As soon as I heard that track, I knew I'd found what I was looking for, and that sound then took me to the Mahavishnu Orchestra, and this is why I'm sat here talking to you, because of Jeff Beck, because of this album. Track 2, Come Dancing, written by Narada Michael Walden, a brilliant tune, funky, groovy, that soul rock interface that he's exploring with the Jeff Beck group in the early 70s, right? This is it done properly. And Narada's playing drums on here, and there's an overdub by a drummer called Ed Green. And Ed Green was the drummer with who was he the drummer with? He's a funk and soul drummer who played with Barry White, I think. Right? Shall we look him up? This is why we've got this, because normally I make this stuff up and then you have to check whether I'm right. So, yeah, he was Barry White, and he played on all of Barry's biggest hits. How funky is that? Narada Michael Walden and Barry White's drummer together on a Jeff Beck track, Come Dancing. Heavy funk. Why is this album not rated as highly as Blow by Blow? Then we have that inspiration of Charlie Mingus through John McLaughlin. The thing that's brought Jeff here, he pays it back with his version of Goodbye Pork by Hat, which of course is greater than any other version of Goodbye Pork by Hat. You know, Charlie Mingus thanked Jeff Beck for doing this, right? This is one of the great moments where you can hear Jeff sing a song. We then have a 2-minute track, Head for Backstage Pass. That's the only filler on this album. Right, turn it over, we have Blue Wind, which is him and Jan Hammer. Jan Hammer's playing everything on that track. It's a classic Jan Hammer composition. Jan Hammer's drumming on it, and I absolutely love the drumming. And although he doesn't have the chops of Tony Williams, I feel like that he's channeling Tony Williams on that drumming. There's incredible solo. It's just the phrasing and the structure of it is so Tony Williams. Absolutely mind-blowing. Then they just hit you in the face. Sophie and Play With Me. Narada Michael Walden compositions, some of the greatest drumming ever recording. That sort of halftime shuffle that Narada plays on Play With Me. It's greater than Rosanna, it's greater than Fall in the Rain. Go and check it out, see if you can play it, see if you can get that and get that China on the off. Absolutely mind-blowing. I'm getting excited just thinking about it. I'm getting excited to think about it. It's this album is made great because Jan Hammer's on it, and Jan Hammer is the man. Jan Hammer is the man. I've said this elsewhere. Jan Hammer is the Charlie Parker of jazz fusion. He's the greatest. He's the guy that defines the sound. And Narada Michael Walden is just across the board. It's got every area sewn up. Narada to me is just so full of light and joy. Right? That's what his music is. It's just so full of light and joy and positivity. I never get the feeling that this is a virtuoso drummer jumping through these incredible hoops like I do with other incredible drummers. I feel that Narada's in there and he's just feeling it and he is feeling the joy. And then you listen to what he's doing and you're realising he is doing that. You never get the feeling that that is what his drumming is about. His drumming is about love and joy and positivity. Right? And those two elements on this album make it one of the greatest jazz fusion albums ever made. Right? Wired, better than Blow by Blow. And Blow by Blow is one of the greatest fusion albums ever made. He then teams up with Jan Hammer. He goes out on tour. And this just shows you where Jeff Beck's allegiances are. You know, and he goes out on tour and records Jeff Becker with the Jan Hammer Group live. Absolutely fantastic live album. I always forget about it. It's absolutely brilliant. It's incredible to hear the Jeff Beck pitted against the Jan Hammer Group, because this is one of the greatest fusion groups in history. This is the group with he's got is it Fernando Saunders on bass, Tony Smith on drums, and Stephen Kindler for the Mavis Structure on violin. This is one of the great fusion bands that didn't have the success it deserved, which is astonishing when they're teamed up with the multi-million selling Jeff Beck on this album, and they still didn't seem to have the success they would deserve. I'm looking at the reviews for this album, and on AllMusic it's got an average of 2-star reviews. I have never understood this. When I was a kid growing up, I had my Rolling Stones book of rock and roll, and the Jeff Beck albums had done pretty well, except for this album, which had like 1 star. And I do not understand why this gets rated so lowly critically, and I think it hurt the album. It's a discussion that we could have elsewhere. I put the album on over and over again. It's incredibly recorded. It's a brilliant live sound. They're playing brilliantly. It's a mixture of compositions off the 2 classic albums with Full Moon Boogie, which is a Jan Hammer composition that he did with Jerry Goodman. I never quite understood this. In Jeff Beck's catalogue, from 77 to 1980, he doesn't make an album for 3 years. What he does do is a whole bunch of session work on a whole ton of jazz fusion albums. And I was on this video originally, my intention was to go through all those sessions and sort of, you know, really present them, because there's so many incredible appearances by Jeff Beck on all sorts of different albums. But it's deserving of a video, so that might come across in the future. But check him out on Journey to Love by Stanley Clarke. You know, that's almost like an essential Jeff Beck album to have. He's on this album, he's on this Narada Michael album, I think he's on Saint and the Rascal, you know. But there's a whole bunch of session work. He is in the fusion world, right? But he's restless. You can tell he's restless. And in this 1980, he goes back in the studio with Jan Hammer, with the great Simon Phillips on drums, also with Tony Hymas on keyboards, and he makes an album called There and Back. And this is his last great jazz fusion album. And it's as great as Wired and the live album and Blow by Blow. It's an absolutely monumental album. It sees Jeff Beck, considering the 80s, there's a lot of sequencing, there's a lot of synthesis on there. He just doesn't fall foul for all the horribleness that we were about to have in the 80s. Doesn't fall foul. This is one of the great fusion albums. I think what he's doing on this, it's a lot closer to rock. And Jan Hammer's input is just, again, the album wouldn't exist without Jan Hammer on there. It opens up with a track called Star Cycle, which ended up being the theme in the UK for The Tube. Does anyone remember The Tube? Remember that incredible music that would open it up, that sort of futurist electronic music? That was off this album. Over in America, it was used on the Mid-South Wrestling show. So Americans may have heard this as a TV theme as well. The tune The Pump, which is a fusion track, which is an exercise in economy. Hardly anything happens in that tune. And it's absolutely brilliant. That was used in the film Risky Business. So this is an album that's really got culturally quite an important stake in terms of jazz fusion. For me, the high point is, of course, Space Boogie. The incredible, I think it's in 9/8 with that incredible shuffle. It seems like the sort of natural extension of Quadrant 4 by Billy Cobham. You know, Quadrant 4 from space. Well, Quadrant 4 sounds like from space anyway. On this video, I'm coming up to 52 minutes, and we've basically covered what for me is the classic period of Jeff Beck. This is the most important bit. I'm now going to speed up and just give you a quick run through what he did. In the 1980s, he's got into guest star mode. He's not doing that once. We only actually get, I think, 2 or 3 albums in 1980s. They're like sort of 5 years apart. So after There and Back, we don't get another album till Flash in 1985. But he appears on a whole ton of other records. Flash is a troublesome album. It's produced by Nile Rodgers, major label, and obviously the label were trying to now establish him as a pop star. I think he reluctantly did this, and since then he has really, you know, been critical of this album. The thing about this album that's interesting is if you actually listen to the guitar playing on it, right, Jeff Beck is always moving forward with his guitar playing. Right, what he sounds like in 1969 is entirely different to what he sounds like in 1989. Most guitarists, this doesn't happen. Most guitarists, they come out, they do their thing, and then that's what they do. With Jeff Beck, he's continually moving forward. And on this album, he sort of emerges after being away in this world of now 80s rock guitar heroes, Joe Satriani, Vinnie Moore, Steve Vai, Yngwie Malmsteen. And it's not like he can hold his own. It's like he just comes in and just shows everybody how to do it. And when I bought this album, I put the first track on, which is called Ambitious, which like is an MTV staple, had a pop video that went in with it. And it's a cool song, I quite like it. But when he gets to the guitar solo, Jeff Beck's gone up a gear. It's like incredible playing. It includes the instrumental Escape that was written by Jan Hammer, and that's a pretty cool tune as well. But the rest of it is a little bit dire, especially when Jeff's singing. They're obviously trying to make him into a pop star, you know, and they've given him the full Nile Rodgers treatment. The idea, I think, was this would be his Let's Dance, you know. I think that's the idea with this. It is that sort of hyper-produced 80s Nile Rodgers production, all, you know, drum machines and samplers and, you know, lots of chic type little funky guitar riffs wound in, all very Power Station. If you remember the band Power Station, which I love, and I love Let's Dance, and I love Nile Rodgers, but it just doesn't quite work. On the whole, it doesn't quite work. It's undone in places by just too much 80s production and too much sequencing and not enough real drumming. We do see him get back together with Rod Stewart on the record People Get Ready, which is a Kirsten's Melter, and that's good. There's some good stuff on here. There's incredible guitar playing on it. It's just mired by commerciality. It's Jeff Beck's sellout album, and it's a shame because the only real album we get from him in the 1980s, is it 1980? Yeah, no, I didn't know it was 1989 or 1990. He then returns in 1989 with Jeff Beck's Guitar Shop. Now, by this time, I have become Terry Bozio's biggest fan. I am playing like Terry Bozzio. I'm learning his licks. I've got, in 1987, I've bought the Terry Bozzio solo drums tuition video, and every day I get up and I watch that video and then I try and play the stuff. I'm a Terry Bozzio freak. I'm a Jeff Beck freak, but I'm a Terry Bozzio freak. And then it's announced he's going to be making an album with Jeff Beck. And not only is he going to be making an album, he's going to be making an album in what sounds like a Tony Williams lifetime structured trio. In other words, guitar, drums, keyboards. And it is. It's a classic organ trio in effect, but they're going to, on this album for me, redefine instrumental rock music again. This is the third great innovatory album for me. It's innovatory that by this point Jeff Beck has thrown away the guitar pick. He's using his fingers, and once he's got his fingers on the strings, it's as though he's able to coax for absolutely every sound. He doesn't use tons of effects. Sometimes he'll just have a reverb, and with that reverb and his volume pedal and the different pickup positions, and especially the use of the tremolo arm. You got to remember, in the 70s he's using a Les Paul a lot of the time. I think he started using a Strat when he started doing all the talk box stuff, which is pretty innovative. But here he's now playing a Strat. On Flash, I think he's playing a Jackson, so he's got that sort of much more biting metal sound. But here he's got a Strat, and this has become the sort of classic Jeff Beck sound. His guitar playing changes here, and it just goes up a notch. The evening that it was announced that Jeff Beck had died, everyone started posting up tunes. I posted up Goodbye Pork Pie Hat because I thought the title had resonance, but most people were putting up the tune Where Were You off this album. Brian May comes out and he did a video and he said, you know, if you don't know what Jeff Beck's about, go and listen to Where Were You. So basically, in terms of Jeff Beck's guitar playing, Guitar Shop is, I think, the peak. It really is. So at that point in his career, he's able to step up. But the other thing about this album is it's incredible. Is Tony Hymas is basically doing everything else, and the way he uses the keyboards, you never feel like you're listening to cheesy keyboards. The keyboard playing just wraps around this and gives it a massive sound. And this is really coming from Terry Bozzio. Terry Bozzio is going to go on to do all this solo drumming stuff. He's going to take the snares off and he's going to be doing all this solo drum. For the last 30 years he's been doing that. This is the last hurrah for Terry Bozzio. This is when he was still playing drums. His drum kit is pretty huge at this point, but nowhere near like what he's got now. But he's still playing the drums. This is the last point we really see it. This and I think Sex and Religion with Vi. I went to see Jeff Beck on this tour in 1990, and it was a game changer. Seeing Terry Bozzio and seeing Jeff Beck, I was right up close, literally a few feet away from Jeff Beck. I was like able to watch him play the guitar, and the interplay between him and Tony Hymas, and especially Terry Bozzio, and seeing Terry Bozzio's huge black kit. And Terry Bozzio had like chains between his nose and his ears, and he had a chain between his nipples, and he had this like blonde hair that was tied up in a big ponytail and his shirt off. His drum kit was black, his cymbals was black, the hardware was black, the drum heads was black. I think if I got on stage and looked at the little washers would have been black. And this totally changed my idea of what drumming was. Up until then I was listening to Vinnie Colaiuta, Dave Weckl, and I was a real jazz fusion snob, and it was all about playing cool and doing this. And then to see the performance, the iconic performance of Terry Bozzio and the iconic performance of Jeff Beck, you know, and to see someone making instrumental music that wasn't mired in jazz, right? It was rooted in something else. That was a mind-blowing experience for me, right? We've just hit the hour on this video. I didn't expect to do an hour. We've just hit the hour, so I will carry on. But for me, this is the last really innovative period. Since then, Jeff Beck has gone on to make a whole ton of incredible albums. We get the next album. Is that the one where he does... I mean, there's Frankie's House, which is a soundtrack album, but I think he teams up with the Big Town Playboys, doesn't he? And he does Crazy Legs in '93, right? The Big Town Playboys are a band that originated in my town. When I was a kid, I used to go walk to school and sat outside his house. As I walked to school, I'd walk past Mike Sanchez, the great Mike Sanchez, who had just had this local band that were doing sort of rockabilly stuff. The Big Town Playboys then went on to world fame. Mike ended up, you know, working with Bill Wyman, and in '93, Jeff Beck pulled the Big Town Playboys in to do an album of Gene Vincent songs as a tribute to his hero Cliff Gallup. Great album, but it's interesting because this is suddenly we see Jeff Beck looking back, which is quite interesting. But he doesn't keep doing that. And then in 1999, he brought out Who Else? Now, if I'm really honest, it's the last album I bought by Jeff Beck. On this album, he is exploring instrumental jazz fusion, guitar-based jazz fusion, but he's mixing it with electronica and techno. So this guy's still, it's absolutely fantastic album. It sees him teaming back up with Tony Hymas. This is the last album I bought. It was really great. I think Jan Hammer's on here. Then we get You Had It Coming, which again is the same type of ideas. He's toned it down, but he's still exploring modern sounds on here. And then we get the album Jeff. That comes out in when's this? I don't know these albums so well, but I wanted to cover it. So this is 2003. So we're going back 20 years now. And I don't know these albums so well. I did check them out at the time. There's some really great tunes on these. Of these three albums, the tune that's sort of come out and gone into sort of public consciousness is Nadia, where he does a sort of guitar version of an Indian classical vocal piece that I think was by Nitin Sawhney, or may have been by Talvin Singh. I don't know. I think it's Nitin Sawhney. See, I'm out. I'm not following Jeff Beck at this point, but this is good stuff. It's not an artist that is like resting on his laurels or lost their way. He is making great albums. 2010, it's a long gap. We get Emotion and Commotion, which he made with an orchestra, and then I think we've had Loud Hailer, which sees him going back to vocal music. I'm really going to go through this quick so I can finish off. And then, you know, last year we saw him teaming up with Johnny Depp, which is again is bizarre, and making that album, which I haven't heard. But over the last 20 years or so, he has still been pushing the envelope, touring. And through all of this, he was Jeff Beck. You know, if you saw him on the TV, he looked exactly like he did in the 1970s. Same hair, same iconic look. He could play the guitar. His strengths were there. So obviously what's happened in the last few weeks is he's just been cut down with a really horrible, disease. Caught bacterial meningitis, and it's took him out, which is an absolute terrible thing. It's been a shock, and those shock waves have gone out across the world. I did do a bit of prep for this video. I sat down and I started to write his career out, and I felt, and I'm going to put my neck out, this is an artist that has really innovated for the whole of his career. But in terms of music history, there's three real innovatory moments. there's that moment where he's one of the architects of rock music itself in the late 60s with the Yardbirds and with the Jeff Beck group. There's the fusion period in the 70s where he is really exploring instrumental music and making instrumental music a commercial viable form, you know. And by commercial I mean where the music's great and cutting edge and where people want to buy it and listen to it in the same way as they would buy a vocal pop album, you know, because the tunes are strong and because his voice is strong and he's a great singer of songs. And then, as I think since then, he has been pushing his guitar playing and pushing guitar playing to the max, and he has never stopped doing that through all of these albums right up to date. But I think the peak of that is on the Guitar Shop album, where you really hear his guitar playing at its peak. And I think if anyone wants to just have one album to check out his guitar playing, then it's going to be the one that's over that shoulder, actually, which is Guitar Shop by Jeff Beck. What a musician. I hope this has been meaty enough and long enough to satisfy those who really wanted to do a deep dive. I hope it acts as a tribute to a musician that for me has been there all my life. And I really think if I hadn't have heard Jeff Beck, I just would have been one of those guys that would have stuck listening to Led Zeppelin and Deep Purple and Black Sabbath. I meet them all the time, and I would not have been able to open the door to the whole world, to all this lot here: Coltrane, Stravinsky, Pierre Boulez, Frank Zappa, Gladys Knight and the Pips. So that last one I just threw in because I saw an album there. I didn't even know I got a Gladys Knight and the Pips album. Shall we just pull that out and finish up with something that's got nothing to do with Jeff Beck? What the hell's this? Look at that. That does not look like a proper Gladys Knight and the Pips album. This is on the Hallmark Records label. You know, maybe she's not even on it. Pickwick International. I got a ton of albums like this in here. Jeff Beck is a musician that opened me up to absolutely everything. You know, 13-year-old me would never have listened to Gladys Knight. You know, I listened to rock musicians with long hair that looked cool, with tight trousers, that played guitar, played rock guitar. And that's what Jeff Beck was. And when I heard him, he opened up the world to me. All right, he was the guy that did it. He's been there my whole life. I've seen him live. When I was playing with Robert Plant, our sound engineer, tour manager, the great Roy Williams that had worked with Jeff Beck, had a phone call from Jeff Beck, and I was stood next to him while he was talking to Jeff Beck. I never got to meet him, but that was the closest I came. You know, it was, and I think, oh my God, Roy's actually speaking to actual Jeff Beck. And the reason they were talking was because there was talk that Jeff Beck might come and jam with us on a gig. And I can remember we turned up in Gloucester and we set the gig up, and then the crew came out and they put an extra guitar amp on stage. And I said, what's that for? And they said, oh, Jeff Beck might come tonight. And the whole, can you imagine then me trying to do the rest of the gig? And it was like, I get to the last song and I'm going, when's he going to be here? And he never turned up. It was a shame. And of course, if he had, this video would have been entirely different and it would have been a different story. But the power of that guy to ruin a gig for me as I stood there in expectation. Jeff Beck, genius guitarist, genius musician, classic rock musician, one of the great iconic musicians of all time. Thanks for all the music, Jeff. This won't be the last time you mentioned on my channel, and it wasn't the first, but we love what you did. We love you, Jeff. We love the music. Thanks for it all, and thanks to you for watching. And if you like this video, please like it. If you made it through the hour and 10 minutes and you're still here now, thanks for staying to the end. So you gotta like it and subscribe now. Put a comment down below, and if you want to support me in what I'm doing, making these videos, then please become a Patreon. And if you go to Patreon right now, you will see there's a great big essay that I wrote as preparation for this video, and you can see where I got a lot of my ideas from and how I formed and then a little bit more detail that was in there. And you'll actually see that one of my patrons had come on and then told me the story about how Jeff Beck didn't do Woodstock, and so many of my ideas are now formed by the incredible comments that come from my absolutely knowledgeable and, you know, beautiful patrons that we now have over there And it's a right laugh, and I enjoy being able to put stuff up on there that I couldn't put up on here. Right, so what sort of stuff is that? If you don't want to know, if you want to know, then click on Patreon. If you don't want to know, then don't. Go away. Bye-bye. Go and see Rick Beato. He's waiting there for you. Thank you. See you on the next video. Bye.